What is conflict theory? Conflict theory is actually a collection of theoretical frameworks aimed at explaining historical, social, political, and economic factors that influence human behavior and explain social phenomena. These theories provide the basics for understanding conflict between individuals, groups, communities, and larger social structures from the conflict perspective. That also includes ideas that might conflict between individuals, groups, communities, and those same social structures. Conflict theory believes that inequality contributes to the conflict and change that society is built on. Understanding how inequalities are rooted in society and how to reduce those inequalities is a core concept in conflict theory. Competition for resources also contributes to the societal conflict that conflict theory aims to explain. Common forms of conflict referenced in conflict theories is coercion, control, constraint, and dominance. There are also a lot of references to power relations, competition in economics, social change, or resistance to change. Exploitation of individuals based on class, race, gender, religion, and education are also often common forms of conflict that are referenced. Conflict theory is not as popular or referenced as often as other systems theories, and conflict theory inherently conflicts with the functional systems theory. The conflict theory offers a sociological point of view that expands on the analysis provided by structural functionalism to create a more complete explanation of contributing factors of social differences and inequalities. The systems theories says that social interactions rooted and held together by cooperation, consensus, and accomplishing or attempting to maintain stability. Whereas the conflict theory says that change is normal and conflict is natural in maintaining social life and all of the factors that come with it. The evolution of conflict theories started with early philosophers worldwide that created theories of conflict to try and explain the power relations, social instability, revolution, and social solidarity that took place in different societies. Theories of conflict in Indian, Chinese, and Greek philosophy date back to even 5th century BC. These philosophical viewpoints influenced more building blocks that led to what is now considered conflict theory. Writings from early political philosophers influenced the theoretical basis for political concerns that later influenced classical economics and even biological phenomena. Early philosophers influenced the conflict theorists like Karl Marx, who went on to influence other theorists and contemporary theorists today that draw on all of the concepts and apply them to the new society and all of the new evolutions that take place. Historical conflict concepts impact modern social work theory and practice. People like George Simmel, who say that forms of interactions and types of interactants applied to groups, and the research and information that he was able to collect led to understanding group conflict dynamics and discoveries that influence the social work traditions of group work now. Human preferences compete and interchange based on intra and interpersonal conflicts, and that information that George Simmel was able to find is still used in social work today when trying to understand conflict and the way that groups interact with one another. Karl Marx is said to be the leading architect explaining how society evolved and will continue to in regards to conflict theories. He was a German philosopher that believed societal conflict is continual and inevitable due to the inequality that breeds from social class differences. Karl Marx believed that social world oppresses people, but that people also influence and contribute to their own oppression and society's maintaining of that oppression. Marx believed that society was a polarization of two dominant classes, which would now be equivalent to the working class versus the elites. The elites are in control of capitalism and industry by dictating people's labor and treating laborers as property. Poverty was explained by Marx through the wealthy on the polar opposing end than the working class, leading to accumulation of misery, slavery, ignorance, brutality, and alienation overall in society when viewing the non-dominant group. Wealth and power was in the hands of few while the remaining people were in poverty. Marx viewed capitalism as naturally oppressive through class antagonism and struggles over resources. He believed that capitalism was full of exploitation of laborers that contributed to the divide and tension between the two classes and groups, which could now be applied to the understanding of the rich versus the poor. He believed that the wealthy class used their economic power to impact the political power and maintain their current state in society that allowed the powerful to stay powerful and the oppressed to remain oppressed. He believed that ideology of people in power created the alienation of the non-dominant group, and that the wealthy people used their power to influence the politics and overall societal influences that led to them to stay in power. He desired a classless and stateless society, which would be described as a utopia. He predicted that communism would replace capitalism, and following generalizations of Marxists focus on scholars reapplied old concepts to understand new formulations of social phenomenon as society evolves. For example, Marx did not consider the impact that technology would have on society and capitalism, and he also didn't consider social policy and how compromises in social policy could diffuse potential for radical revolution, whereas Marx would have preferred for radical revolution to take place in order for change to be possible in regards to conflict theories. These are some definitions from the conflict theory perspective, just so that you know how to apply these concepts throughout the rest of the presentation, and also during the video that you have to watch later. From the conflict theory perspective, conflict is described as a clash or struggle between opposing forces or interests. For example, political party affiliation represents two opposing forces and interests that have very different views that often clash. Power is described as the ability to control and influence collective decisions that impact the broader group. Contributing factors of power are wealth, race, political influences, and support. The word minority is described as groups that have limited access to resources or power, even if they are numerically the majority. For example, racial minorities in the United States, LGBT people, or even people with disabilities. Change is described as a transition or transformation from one current state to another. Change can be rapid or radical, or slow or conservative. Main concepts in conflict theory are that all societies sustain injustices and inequality, and the dominant groups in society control the power that influence the lives of the individuals in that society. Power is unequally distributed, and it leads to some groups dominating over others. Conflict builds to create social change, and the resistance to. Conflict theories would explain conflict between groups as society built on social struggles of inequality and social differences. Conflict can be between social groups or categories of people. There are the dominant and the non-dominant groups, and that can be determined by discrimination, denying access to resources, systematic oppression, political barriers, and so on. Conflict theories focus on two main concepts for group conflicts. Class conflict, which is the competition between classes, creates tension and antagonism of the minority groups or the non-dominant groups. Interest group conflict is when organized groups form based or shared interest and work to promote and protect their shared interests by influencing government and systems in society to maintain the oppression of the opposing interest group. In order to reduce inequality and social change has to be a priority, as well as education. That will help take the minority groups and the non-dominant groups and give them a more equal playing field and opportunity to push back against the current definition of who is dominant, who is non-dominant, and who has power and who does not, which would go on to then further influence political influences that lead to the access to resources and the maintaining of the status quo. Past and present struggles of racial minorities in the U.S. is sustained by the more powerful and wealthy dominant group, which in this country currently would be white people or people that pass as white. Conflict theory would explain racial injustice as part of the struggles and conflict that maintain the status quo and push back against social change and or promote it. Right now, there's a lot of push for social change regarding racism and being more inclusive and understanding of the variety of identities that people have in the United States. The major historically noted conflicts that were rooted in race in this country would be described as conflict that rose when the dominant class was threatened by the minority group. For example, Jim Crow laws were created following the end of the Civil War to restrict African Americans politically, economically, and socially, just as they were slowly gaining status in this country. Conflict between white and black Americans has evolved and displayed itself in a variety of ways. Things like voter suppression, food deserts, and education funding are just a few examples that prove, from a conflict theory perspective, that the dominant class feels threatened by a minority group, so they push back in ways to keep an oppressed group oppressed and to keep themselves in power. Police brutality and racism is also another way that is expressed.
We all know what makes a conflict. It is unequal. When two different groups of people have unequal resources, when they have unequal or different positions in the society, there will be conflict. So what makes the conflict between police culture and the black people? First of all, let's talk about what is the police culture. Police culture is a set of the values that shape how police officers perceive their working environment and act within it. So where are the values come from? Values from officers who came to the police department way earlier, and then they transfer the value to the next generation. So when police officers get used to the way the white people talking or acting, they will say that black people are different. So what is the difference? A police officer in Georgia has left his position after he was recorded on a dashboard camera when he was trying to convince a white woman that she had nothing to worry about during a traffic stop because she was not black. But you are not black, the police officer replies. Remember, we only kill black people. Yeah, we only kill black people, right? The police is a part of the government, and he was a part of the white population as well. So what if others who just simply don't like black people? Will they consider that being racist is okay? Because even the officer from the government was saying that. Since Darren Wilson shot and killed Michael Brown in 2014, the problem of police violence against African Americans has been a relatively silent feature of the nationwide discussions about race. Black people think that police officers are killing no one but black people. Police officers think that black people are dangerous. There are a lot of opinions from different perspectives around our life, and everybody knows that there is a conflict. So if you was a part of the African American, what is your thought going to be? What would you do to fight for the right that you deserve after hearing the conversation from the white police officer? The Bureau of Justice Statistics says that black offenders committed 52% of the homicide. So we have heard about this kind of opinion more than enough. No matter if it is true or not, it is simply telling people that most of the black people you have seen are bad. So, is that true? Let's assume it is true. So here's a question coming up. Why? Why 50% of the homicide are from black people? So what makes that?
So, understanding conflict theory and how it plays out in our careers and the applications of conflict theory to social work practice is very important. Social workers should understand how conflict impacts their clients and the communities that they serve and society at large. And social workers should work to investigate where those conflicts come from and any inequality or oppression that is created as a result of those conflicts. Social workers should help clients navigate the oppression that they experience as a result of conflict, but also they should advocate for the oppressed and advocate for those who are vulnerable because of conflict in society. It's very important that we're constantly challenging the injustices that create conflict and looking at conflict and seeing the way it creates injustice in itself, because it all contributes to social inequality. And social workers should always familiarize themselves with power structures to gain deeper understanding of what it means for there to be conflict in society. So that means addressing racism, addressing sexism, classism, xenophobia, all sorts of things that create oppression and create conflict, or these things that happen as a result of conflict.
How conflict theory informs social work practices. The conflict theory explains and helps social workers understand how power structures and power disparities impact people's lives. By using this theory opposed to system theories that are best used as models for assessment, conflict theories use both assessment and intervention as means of developing solutions for conflict. In the clip, you were able to see how President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson saw how horrible blacks were being treated, and from this assessment, they were able to come up with different intervention strategies. On the macro level, social workers can advocate for policies and legislation that can change the political discourse. For example, the conflict between Black American and white Americans has produced several laws and court decisions. The 14th Amendment gave former slave citizenship. The 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned Plessy v. Board of Education. And what you're going through, and that this situation will not defeat them. In regards to family conflict, social workers should work with families to find a common ground and walk them through the process on how to display empathy within the family. For example, many Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement chose not to overtly protest for their rights, but other members in their family did, which caused a divide within the family. On the macro level, social workers can advocate for policies and legislation that can provide social justice for all people. For example, the conflict between Black Americans and white Americans has produced several laws and court decisions. The 14th Amendment gave former slave citizenship. The 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, found that segregation of Black and white schools was unconstitutional. And the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In these particular situations, conflict resulted in change for Black Americans. However, many can argue that Black Americans, along with all people of color, are still being treated unfairly in today's society, and that conflict in regards to race is still taking place. One of the most relevant conflicts taking place in today's society is between people of color and the criminal justice system. They are being put in prison for long periods of time for criminal acts that don't match the crime and being killed by police officers during routinely traffic stops. Social movements such as Black Lives Matter are endlessly advocating for criminal justice reform and developing intervention strategies for violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes.
Our discussion questions are: what are some fundamental strengths and weaknesses of the conflict theories in terms of social work? And would you use some of the concepts from conflict theories in social work practice? If so, how? And what do you think about Karl Marx's idea or opinion of the most desirable form of society resembling a utopia? Do you think a utopian society is achievable?